Hi. This podcast includes stories of gender-based violence, sexual assault, and child abuse. Please listen with care. Welcome to Signal for Help. I'm Nanaba Duncan. Now, if you're here, you already know that gender-based violence is complex. But when I'm telling you that the goal of this show is simple, that's true. There's one thing we're here to do, and that's learn what to do when someone you know is experiencing abuse. It's the whole reason why we made this show with the Canadian Women's Foundation. Anybody can be abused, anybody, no matter their background, how rich or poor, where you live, what you do. But Indigenous women and girls are at even higher risk. Indigenous women make up about 5% of all women in Canada. But 21% of all women killed by an intimate partner are Indigenous.
When I started covering missing and murdered, I realized that I was a survivor of that.
That's Brandi Morin. She's an award-winning journalist and author. She covers breaking news and historic events, from the Pope's trip to Canada to address the Catholic Church's role in residential schools, to the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. Brandi does so much heavy lifting with her reporting. She connects the dots. For example, over half of all children in foster care are Indigenous, while they only make up 7% of the overall population in Canada. Brandi writes stories connecting the intergenerational trauma of generations of Indigenous kids taken from their families through colonialism and systemic discrimination with the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. And all this work started with her personal experience, which she's going to share with you now. And a gentle reminder here that this story includes mention of sexual assault of a child. So let's start with who you are. Can you introduce yourself?
Tanse, hello, bonjour. I am Brandi Morin. I am a freelance journalist of Cree, Iroquois, and French descent. I'm based in Treaty 6 territories, which are the lands of my ancestors, west of Edmonton in so-called Alberta. I am a mother of 4 living children from the ages of 23 to age 4. And I absolutely love what I do and consider it a privilege to be a storyteller.
That might be the best introduction I've heard in a very long time.
Maybe I'm used to it.
Yeah, you're used to it. I'd like to hear about young Brandi. What did you dream of being and doing with your life back when you were younger?
You know, I didn't have a whole lot of time to think about what I wanted to do when I was older, because the majority of the time I was like living in survival mode. But I was quite a dreamer nonetheless. I just wanted to grow up and do big things in the world. In fact, for a long time, when I was younger, I wanted to be a famous singer or an actress. And I grew up and I, sang in church and that kind of thing. But I think at that time, I associated being famous with being liked and being loved. And I think because I didn't feel like I was loved, that I thought that that would be the answer, to what I was looking for.
You mentioned survival mode. What was going on that would make it necessary for you to be in survival mode?
I came from a pretty dysfunctional family. My dad was an alcoholic, and my mom had a lot of trauma from her own childhood and a lot of anger and frustration towards what was going on with her marriage to my dad. And so there was a lot of fighting at home, yelling, screaming, verbal abuse, physical abuse happening, and just complete chaos. And I became too much for my mother to handle, so she told me. It started with me going to live at a couple of homes with families from our church. And then from there, turned into my mom handing me over to the foster care system.
How old were you when you entered foster care?
Well, I think I was around 7 when I went into started living with my first family outside of the home, like a family from church, a couple of families. And then progressed from there. And my first, longer term foster home, I would have been about 10. And I stayed there for a couple of years. Although I would go home maybe every second weekend or so to visit with my family.
How were you feeling at that time? It must have been pretty emotional.
So I know that I was very angry. I know that I was a very lonely little girl and a very confused little girl. And I always just took on this notion that there was something wrong with me and that I was bad. My mother would say that I was too much to handle, that I was bad, that I was out of control, that I wasn't listening.
You eventually entered a group home. How old were you at that time, and what was the change like?
So I started being placed into group homes, and one of them was what was called the Yellowhead Youth Center, and it was in Edmonton. We were just a bunch of lost, kind of messed up kids. There was kids from, all walks of life, a mixture of ages. I, again, was still pretty defiant. I think that I just was angry about my situation in my life and kind of being displaced from my family. And I formed some friendships, and I had a couple of girls there that were older than me. At that time, it is a big deal, like those age gaps at that age. I looked up to them. I thought they were cool.
You also ran away with these folks. Can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, so one night, it was a winter's night, we were outside having a cigarette, and I think we had earned the privilege to go off the grounds of the group home. So we were just I think on the sidewalk in front of the home, and we were just talking about how we were bored. And one of my friends named Shannon, suggested that we run away, that we take off. And it was known as going AWOL. I had done it before. I had ran away before from different places. I was sick of all those, concrete walls, which were our bedrooms. So we decided, and we took off running, and we ran all the way to downtown Edmonton. Went to an apartment building, and Shannon knew these individuals in this apartment. So we walked in, and the apartment was filled with cigarette smoke, and it was very sparsely furnished. And I was thinking, okay, so, this is where the party is, right? There was 2 men there. One of the men was in the living room smoking a cigarette, and another man came up to us, and he had a pack of cigarettes, and he was offering us all smoke. And I was wondering, okay, where's this party? And so this one man asked for me to go into the bedroom with him. And I was 12 years old at this point. And I agreed to go in the bedroom with him. There was a couple of beds in there, and he forced himself upon me and raped me. And that is how I lost my virginity. And I remember asking, crying out for help. And they didn't come to help me. And I remember being really, really confused by that. And after he raped me, he had got up and gone to the bathroom or whatever. And not long after that, I got up and I went to the bathroom, and I heard laughter coming from the living room of this apartment. And they were just all, having a good time. I was upset, and I had to take a few moments in that bathroom to pull myself together, because I didn't want to go back out into the living room hysterical, because I was afraid that maybe I would get hurt again, or afraid I don't know what. So I put on this act and splashed water on my face and went out into the living room, and they were smoking cigarettes and drinking beer. And I just kind of went along with it. And I know it sounds absurd, but you got to understand, I was 12 years old. I was in an unfamiliar place at night. I had just been raped. I had called out for help. My friends didn't help me. And so I just kind of went into this mode of survival. And I think that I was gone for about a week, but I know that at some point we were moved to the other side of the city. I was held against my will, but I was able to plan my escape from there and was able to convince these men to let me go and let me go to my grandmother's. Cookham is her name in Cree, and escape.
Brandi, I just want to say I'm sorry that happened to you. I'm sorry to you now, and I'm sorry to the 12-year-old you were.
Oh, hi. So when I finally reached my Cookhams, I ran out of the car and into her house and just shut the door behind me. I felt like I was safe. I went there and I didn't tell Cookham what happened. I felt a lot of shame and confusion. I was able to stay at her home a couple of days, and then she said, okay, Brandi, because she had learned that I had run away, she said, you have to go back to the group home. And so I went back to the group home. I didn't tell anybody what happened until I did work up the courage to tell one of the workers that I had trusted.
And what did they say?
Well, I just went into the office there and told her, what happened. I was really nervous. Again, I had these feelings of shame, of uncertainty. And I just told her, I was raped, and she was doing some paperwork. And she just looked at me and she said, well, Brandi, that's what happens when you run away. Don't do it again. And so I took that literally, and it confirmed to my 12-year-old mind that I was right, that I brought it on myself, that it was my fault. And I took that on, and I took it on for years, and it devastated me because I was already an angry child, but this instilled even more of a rage inside of me.
And do you know now that it wasn't your fault?
Yes, that is something, that I have been working through over several years, but I didn't even face it until I was in my 30s, and I'm 42 now. It took a lot. It took a lot for me to understand that, yes, it wasn't my fault.
That worker said, that's what you get, instead of giving you what you needed in that moment and validating your experience in a non-judgmental way. What do you wish she would have said?
I hope that she would have said, like, oh my God, what can I do to help you? Are you okay? Offer me support, offer me counseling at that age. To this day, even though I have forgiven, I've moved on. And I think that maybe if I could have been, saved from that and really understood my value, that would have been more instilled in me, then it could have saved me a lot of heartache. But at the same time, I have worked through that, and I am, a lot more empowered now.
My understanding is that part of addressing things was your decision to go into journalism and telling people's stories and using your voice to be, in a way, the voices of others, and the ear that you missed out on as a young girl who lived through something so traumatic. How does that work you do play into your healing?
I had been in my late 20s, I was doing a lot of soul searching and really praying about what I should be doing with my life. What would be my purpose? How can I make an impact in this world? And the answer that I got was through journalism. I was so passionate about being a storyteller. I really, really loved connecting with people and portraying their stories. But, especially when it came to injustices. And I think that that's what I resonated with because I was a person that had experienced injustices. I started a few years after I got into journalism exclusively telling Indigenous stories. There was this parallel journey that I was going on to discover a lot of the missing links with my own roots and my past and the healing and the intergenerational impacts of a lot of different things, such as, residential schools and colonizations and a lot of that little violence that had played out into my own life. I was discovering that as I was covering them. And so it was a really cathartic experience. So when I started covering missing and murdered, I realized that I was a survivor of that. And that healing journey, again, coincided with telling the stories of what's going on with our women and girls. And it at times was excruciating. And, but I was empowered by being a survivor. And I think that people truly need to go back and understand the history of this country, the impacts of colonialism, all of the intergenerational trauma, the systemic racism, all of the different factors that put our women at risk need to be taken into account rather than putting up a mugshot of a missing Indigenous woman and people making assumptions about them and their life.
Thinking back to not just you, but the people who were around you and other folks who experienced gender-based violence, there is a bit of blame that happens. You were talking about it when you're describing how people respond to knowing about missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I wonder, what kinds of things do we need to adjust in our thinking?
Oh, wow. Well, it is never the fault of a victim who is sexually assaulted or physically assaulted or emotionally, verbally assaulted. I think that we have come a long way since I was a young girl, but I still think that there's a lot more work to do for us to understand the ins and outs of consent, for us to understand body sovereignty, for young women and girls to be empowered and to create safety nets for us to be able to report these injustices. And I think, I think there's a lot of good work being done around that. We just need a lot more education.
We've been talking about how responding to somebody without judgment is so crucial when it comes to healing and offering up support. Have you been able to look back and give young Brandi that kind of support, like letting go of the shame and the judgment?
Yes, I think so. Again, it's a continual process. I think I've done a lot of healing, but I think that this is a process that is continual, right? I think that there are times when that trauma, as well as others that I associated with my value and my worth as a person, I think that shows up unconsciously a lot of times. And I have to really dig a lot deeper to remind myself of my capabilities, of my worth, of my voice. I'm able to recognize a lot of things. But I think that some of those things that impacted me, that impacted my self-esteem, my self-confidence, my a lot of these things, I think, it still shows up from time to time. And so I have to work at it, right? I have to continually remind myself of, you are powerful, you are strong, you are safe, you are worthy.
And you are.
Hi. Thank you.
I think you'll agree that Brandi's voice is a gift. And you can read more of her story in her book, Voice of Fire, a memoir of a warrior rising. I am grateful to Brandi for sharing her stories, and I am so glad that she was able to find her path to healing. We know that experiencing gender-based violence can lead to an increased risk of depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. There's an even higher risk of physical ailments like cardiac disease and chronic pain. Those kind of wounds can develop over time and can sometimes take years to heal. But abuse may be hidden, and injuries can remain unseen. As a friend, a colleague, a neighbor, if you know what gender-based violence is, that's a good first step, because then you can be aware of the signs and react in a way that supports that person. What are the steps? Listen. Stay open without judgment or advice, like Brandi said she wished someone had done for her when she was a teen. Ask what they need. Brandi's story reminds us how important it is to respond well to disclosures of abuse. That's how we can help survivors and not create more harm. Imagine if that worker had told Brandi back when she was still a kid, "It's not your fault." Or if they'd said, "How can I support you?" Imagine the sense of healing that we can build when we respond with care and a non-judgmental approach. Now, what if you are experiencing gender-based violence? You can call a shelter just to talk, or call a crisis line with questions. You don't have to move into the shelter or be in an emergency yourself. They're there to help. Of course, if it is an emergency, you call 911. I've talked about a Signal for Help mini course that you can find online, and I highly recommend doing it. I did it. I learned so much. It takes about an hour, and it was designed to help us learn the signs of gender-based violence and what to do when we see them. It's going to make you feel empowered with knowledge. I promise you that one. You can sign up to be a Signal for Help responder and join the learning journey. Just go to signalforhelpresponder.ca. After all, when you know how to respond to the signs of abuse, you can change the story. That's signalforhelpresponder.ca. Signal for Help is a podcast from the Canadian Women's Foundation, made by Media Girlfriends. Producers of this show are Garvia Bailey and Hannah Sung. Associate producer is Elena Hudgens-Lyle. Post-production is by David Moreau. And I'm Nanaba Duncan. Again, if you're feeling like you need support, go to signalforhelpresponder.ca and click on Get Help for links to services and information. Take care of yourself. And thank you for listening.